I figured I could help some people out by going over some basic techniques that I use during the sketch stage of my work. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. First things first, I'm using Photoshop Creative Suite 2 with a Wacom Bamboo Fun pen tablet. The current image I'm working on is set at 3600 by 4800 pixels per inch at 300 dpi. This roughly translates into about 12 by 16 inches. Now, depending on your system, you can work with a larger image or smaller. Basically, this just determines the amount of detail you'll be able to get in a piece. Okay, the first thing I generally focus on in a sketch, particularly one with the character as the focal point, is the anatomy and positioning. During the beginning of a sketch, I might have the general idea of the finished piece in mind, but I take the time to play around and figure out what I want the character to be doing. Once I have that down, I start sketching out the character based on that idea. I definitely find it's best to start out with a stick figure. I don't worry too much about details at this point because those can come a lot later. At this point, you can see I'm starting to flesh out the character. I've had a lot of practice drawing the human figure, and most of the time I don't use references. But if you're not comfortable with your own abilities, I would highly recommend using any online references, books, stuff like that. Knowing more about anatomy can definitely help you with your art. One resource I would definitely recommend, even for beginners, is Sarah Simblett's Anatomy for the Artist. I've got a link to that in the description. Here in the sketch, you can see I'm still fleshing out the character, but if you'll notice, I'm using a little bit of foreshortening and putting down circular guidelines on the leg. Foreshortening is a technique used to make an object appear as if it's pointing towards you or away. Now, one of the best ways to practice foreshortening is to think of objects, especially limbs or other body parts, as cylinders. Again, as a reference, I'm going to recommend a book. This one's called Perspective for Beginners. This covers just about everything you need to know on perspective drawing, and I'll put a link to that as well. Now I'm using a bit more foreshortening on the character to bring her arm and hand towards the viewer. I typically find hands to be the most difficult part on the human body to draw. I can't stress enough how important it is to practice, though. Don't get frustrated if you don't get it right the first few times or the first 100 times. Practicing really pays off. One of the things I like to do is take pictures of my own hands in different positions so I have my own personal set of images to go by. Now that I have the character down, the anatomy is how I want it, her positioning is good, I'll start to do some basic detailing. This is nothing too fancy because later when I'm actually painting the piece, I might change my mind and scrap the details altogether, and I do that a lot. This is generally the point in the sketch where I'm just refining some areas and deciding how I want the character to fit the flow of the overall piece. If you're working on your own sketch and you're using the same process, this is the part where I think you should start brainstorming more. This is basically getting the dynamics down. What's your character wearing? How are the clothes going to fold? Is your character in a windy setting? Stuff like that. Alright, so we are finishing up here. Hopefully this has given you some insight into how I work. This is most certainly not the only way to begin a piece, but it's the one that I find is easiest for myself. Later on, I'll be turning this image into a painting, so keep an eye out for that, and thanks for watching.